What is up, Baton Rouge? Welcome back to the Tiger Pride podcast presented by 225 Magazine. I'm Mark Clements, here as always with the one and only Jarrett Rozier. For the first time this year, we had a few off-season additions. Also, for the first time, we zoom in, channeling our inner Boosie, zooming right by.
Yep.
Yeah, look at that beard coming in real nice.
I don't have any like loose almond butter or anything in here, huh? I just had
No,
had
you're
a little
good.
bit of a.
Although you never know with quarantine what might be going on in the background. Speaking of, how have you been? How's for all those Tiger Pride audience who hasn't caught up with you since we started doing this? How's summer been? How's your quarantine been? What have you been doing to stay busy?
I don't know, man. Every person that I talk to, any coach or other reporter or athlete or family that I talk to that I am not in regular contact with, and so there's this kind of catch-up type period, I pretty much at this point respond, I mean, I'm as all right as you can be in 2020.
Yeah.
I can't complain considering how much wildness in every possible direction people are dealing with. So, I mean, just trying to stay busy despite being in my apartment more in any given week than I'm probably used to in a span of a month or two, and trying to do as much from home instead of being out and about all the time. But it just kind of is what it is right now, ready to see some more football action live. What's been up?
Gotta be missing Happies too a little bit, huh?
Man, that's for the best that I've been out of Happies. I really have more just been anxious to get out, catch up with friends in a little bit more capacity than I've been able to. And I've missed 7-on-7 season and the prospect camps over at LSU over the summer and all of that sort of stuff. So I'm really, as much as anything, just ready to get back around some sports.
Yeah. It's been nice to finally catch up with some of the stuff that started. I know I'm a big soccer fan, so to watch some of those leagues kick back off with no fans, and the NBA playoffs are going on. So it's good to get some kind of something to watch. And so hopefully we'll just, knock on wood, that football can happen. And we'll get into sort of have on the rundown over here some of your thoughts and expectations on if that may still happen. But let's start with some of the big news coming out of LSU. The biggest thing from this past week or so, Ja'Marr Chase, the man, the myth, the legend, number 7, short-lived, but still number 7, opts out for the season. Honestly, the right call for him. And don't know that his stock will ever be higher than it is right now. So I guess it's your initial reaction whenever you heard that he was opting out, and we'll get into some of the downfall of that after this.
Yeah, so Ja'Marr opting out was kind of one of those storylines that was something that obviously just happened and became official this week, but was something that we'd been kind of monitoring behind the scenes for quite a while. I told a couple people I was more surprised that it happened on the timeline that it happened than the fact that it happened at all, because there was a point where I thought it was going to happen at the very beginning of camp. But as much as Ja'Marr and his dad, Jimmy, have talked about the fact that it was a very difficult decision for Ja'Marr, despite all of the obvious financial and potential health reason and just draft stock and all of those reasons to do what he did, he really struggled with the idea of leaving this team. He wanted to be there with them. He wanted to compete with them, despite the fact that there wasn't a lot to gain for him long-term wise. He wanted to wear number 7 in front of whatever semblance of Tiger Stadium fans were going to find out that we're able to have this fall. And so it was something that he really struggled with, but ultimately makes the decision that we were kind of anticipating for a couple weeks there, and announces he's going to go focus on the NFL. And I think it's tough. It definitely has a huge impact because he's the most decorated and arguably talented wide receiver to come through the program in its entire history. And so that changes things for an offense, particularly with a new quarterback that was going to be looking to him an awful lot. But at the same time, there is probably a lot more depth and talent at that position and amongst the pass catchers as a whole than maybe people necessarily realize, because they are some newer names and fresher faces.
So let's go in that direction next. Obviously, Terrace Marshall is the name that everyone's going to point to as the next guy up, because he was expected to have a breakout season already this year. And I guess kind of the next level, there's a lot of really talented guys, not quite as much proven for the most part. Racing McMath is one of the first names that comes up, and he's just uber talented. I mean, you got to see him in high school, and then we saw some glimpses of his talent last year. And one name that, at least to me, just continues to pop up unprompted out of Miles Brennan's mouth. When we interviewed Jamar over the summer, he mentioned him, and Coach O keeps bringing him up, is Coy Moore. Just hasn't missed a day of practice, apparently, is catching everything. I guess, who do you see, aside from those three, or if any of those in particular, kind of jumping out, stepping up to fill some of the shoes, the hole left by Jamar?
I think those are the three that I look at as starters. I immediately texted a couple of people, including Coy's brother Corey, when the Jamar news started to leak out on Sunday, and said, next man up, like, welcome to the starting lineup sort of thing, because Coy was a guy that was pushing Racy to begin with for some big playing time right off the bat. He comes to LSU about as polished as a high school receiver can be, just from all of the finer details. As much as we fall in love with wide receiver prospects for their size, their hands, their speed, and all those things, Coy's route running, commitment to blocking, just doing all of the less sexy type details of being a wide receiver are top notch. And so he was coming in with a mindset of competing for opportunities early. And we've seen that throughout camp, in terms of anytime you ask Coach O about the receivers, Coy's name pops up. And you mentioned the players, anytime they get a chance to reference him, he's a name that keeps popping up. And so Racy, obviously the veteran that was already kind of tabbed as maybe a breakout guy, hopping into the starting lineup along Terrace and Jamar. And Coy, I think, joined Terrace in that lineup. Terrace, a guy that consistently gets underrated, despite the fact that he was catching more balls and certainly more touchdowns early in the season than anyone before that injury. And I think is an early NFL draft talent type guy, leading that receiving core, even with Jamar gone. And so those three stand out to me as starters. Obviously, Eric Gilbert, the tight end, who's going to be eventually kind of a hybrid, versatile type weapon on offense, will have an opportunity to maybe do some different things, but he's starting out really focused on tight end. And then behind them, you've got Kayshawn Butte, another receiver in his 2020 class that has all the speed in the world, track guy, really kind of burst onto the scene early in his high school career as a speedster, and has continued to work to round out his game and become a more complete receiver. I think I'm interested to see how things play out with him. John Trey Kirkland, a guy that gets overlooked a lot on the older side up there with Racy, who I think has an opportunity to step in and have a bigger year than people necessarily anticipate from him. Maybe be sort of a Derek Dillon type guy, an older guy that really shows up huge in some huge spots here and there. And I'm interested to see if he can turn that into a more consistent performance throughout the year, now that the opportunities should be there. And then we've all obviously been waiting on Trey Palmer. With all of his talent, came in as a 5-star. Can he kind of put it together? Because he's as exciting of a prospect as he was, he's kind of found himself in an uphill battle, I think, at times against some of these other guys, both the two more veterans and the two freshmen coming in a year behind him and really hitting the ground running.
And we saw flashes of Trey last year. He had the only punt return touchdown LSU had all year. So obviously the talent's there. And I think the biggest thing, and this is not at all to underestimate the loss of Jamar, because it's obviously huge. I mean, the best receiver in the country, Blitnikoff Award winner, like you said, one of the most decorated LSU players. I mean, arguably one of the most talented, probably, wide receivers I've seen in my lifetime. I mean, you can go back to like the Michael Clayton years and some of those incredible performances, but not to underestimate the loss of Jamar, but you have the depth there. You have a lot of the talent there to make that transition a little bit smoother. And I think when you throw in Eric, is it Eric or Arik? Are we confident on how to say his first name for sure?
I'm fairly confident it's Eric, but
I've heard a few like radio people say Arik. I don't know if Coach O says Arik. I don't know if I'm saying it wrong. I want to make sure I'm not.
So I was kind of uncertain, but O and some other people who I trust more than some others tend to say Eric Gilbert.
Okay. That's what I was rolling with too, but I just wanted to make sure I wasn't butchering this thing.
In psych fashion, I've heard it both ways.
Yeah. So he's also kind of one of the X factors, I think, because when you get him on the field, and if he lives up to all the hype that he comes with out of high school, he's essentially if you're in 3 wide or something, essentially a 4th receiver out there that is kind of a mismatch nightmare. So if you have those 3 that we listed off, the triple M's, Marshall, McMath, Moore, and then you have Gilbert next to him, it just seems like there's a lot of talent out there that even without Jamar, you can still have the ability to move the ball. Again, the offense will not be what it was last year. Obviously, that was one of the best offenses in college football history. Statistically, it was the best. So don't expect that, but I think you can still move the ball, be super productive.
I
But
think
go ahead.
I was going to say, I think one of the biggest themes going into this year that we've talked about this since January, I feel like, but everyone needs to come to terms with the fact that you can't have the best college football season ever every year, because that's not how facilities work. So the faster that everyone can put 2019 out of their mind in terms of a measuring stick, obviously those memories are going to last a lifetime for anyone that watched any of that season, but to not focus every comparison of 2020 on 2019 is going to be the biggest thing that any player, coach, fan can do heading into this season. And if you can take that comparison away and get out of that shadow a little bit, this team, I really do have a confidence in their ability to still be a damn strong football team, as they say in Baton Rouge. And we talked about Gilbert when he committed. He is that type of difference-making, versatile weapon that it was very intriguing. At that time, we talked about being in a Joe Brady offense and some of the things that they could do with a guy that size and that skill set. I think you're going to see the offense bear a lot of similarities, even with both Joes now gone to the NFL. And I think that there's a lot of reasons to be confident on both sides of the ball, despite all of that turnover, historic level of turnover.
Yeah, and I think / hope that people are taking last year, like you said, as a measuring stick and not using that as a measuring stick, but that's kind of the outlier. And you look 2 years ago where LSU's offense was, and it was pretty good, and they were, right on that fringe of being up there with the elites. And I think you can take a step from where that was and kind of use that as like your benchmark of where you want to be and move up from there. With you talk about all the spots they're replacing. You look at the starters from the Natty on who's going to be starting on week 1 against Mississippi State, and there's only a handful of names that are still around. So just obviously with that kind of turnover, you got to lower expectations a little bit in terms of the production, but I think it still doesn't impact a ton of their overall season outlook and where they kind of want to move this program in that direction. Speaking of guys who have opted out, moving on from Jamar, the next name to drop was, I don't even know, is it official that Shelvin is out, or just the reports? I don't know if he's officially said it on Twitter or anything, but Tyler Shelvin, the next name.
Yeah, it has not, as of the point where we're recording this, Tyler hasn't made an official announcement, but he was kind of in that same sort of boat with Jamar, where it was something we were waiting for. And honestly, the deeper we got into fall camp, I thought, maybe something's changed and he's sticking around. And obviously a huge loss on the defensive side of the ball, but again, one where there's some depth. I think particularly this year with this all SEC schedule, and you would have seen it kind of get to this point later in the year, as much as O mentioned this week, if they could lose a couple of guys from this roster at the top end of some spots on the depth chart, that wide receiver and defensive line, or maybe a couple spots where they could stand and do it because there was depth. I think against an SEC schedule, you would certainly love to have Tyler Shelvin in the trenches.
Yeah.
I think you lose something on both sides of the ball, and losing a guy that was one of your top couple of defenders a year ago from the middle of that defensive line against the schedule that awaits is certainly tough. But to O's point, there are some good players still there. Glenn Logan has packed on 30 pounds and slid inside and in an even man front, transitioning under Bo Pelini from the old 3-4 under Aranda, and some talented young guys hopping in there with Jaquelin Roy, Jacobian Guillory and company. Jojo Evans moving back to defense again, now back to where he started before shifting over to center and then guard. And then big Apu Ika has to
See, that's honestly the biggest thing that I'm upset about is I wanted to see some beefy middle of Apu Ika and Tyler Shelvin just busting up O-lines, but we won't get that opportunity anymore.
Yeah, it would have been a lot of fun to watch those two go out there in some packages and be in the middle. But as they say in Baton Rouge, next man up sort of thing. And with Tyler on to the NFL, it'll be Apu stepping in there at the moment alongside Glenn Logan, unless one of these young guys, I say young, slightly younger than Apu, can overtake him. But I think that's kind of the duo you're looking at in the middle of the defensive line. And again, you love to have Tyler Shelvin, just like you'd love to have Jamar Chase, but that's some high quality, a lot of future professional talent that you're talking about in the middle of that defensive line.
Yeah, and I think Shelvin marks, I believe, the fourth LSU player to opt out after Neil Farrell started the train pretty early, followed by Kary Vincent, and then Jamar and Tyler for this past week or so. And so obviously with Neil and Tyler both out, that limits the D-line a little bit. But like you said, all those names you mentioned, while young and some of them not quite as proven, I think there's still plenty of talent there. And that'll be a fun group to watch because we've seen a lot of times, I think it was, the Lockett days, we had some of these freshmen playing on the defensive line that were probably had to play ahead of their time as starters. It'll be fun to watch these guys as freshmen get some rotation action and see that whole group develop into the future. Coach O loves them some D linemen, and now that you can mention the 4-3 under Bo Pelini, it'll be fun to watch that group kind of grow.
And as much as I mentioned that they have to play an all SEC schedule this year, this is kind of a weird, wonky year where we don't know what to expect in a lot of ways day to day, let alone month to month. So if you're going to rely on some younger guys in the rotation, particularly with now everyone in the NCAA gets a complete additional year of eligibility, there's kind of some flexibility in this weird year and kind of take some learning opportunities and some lessons for those guys where they can get them against some tough competition and build on it, not just for this year, but for years to come.
And then staying on the D line, you had two transfers. TK McClendon, who was for a while mentioned as one of the starters at defensive end. He transferred in from JUCO as a tight end, switched over to defensive end, was mentioned as a starter potentially in the early offseason, and has now decided he's going to enter the transfer portal, as well as Justin Thomas, who was really coming along at LSU at parts of last year before he was off the team for a few months, came back to the team, and now he's transferring to UAB. In your mind, how big are those losses? It seems like obviously Justin's a little bit bigger of a loss than TK, but if he was also mentioned as a starter, he was bringing something to the table there too. So just a few more knocks off the defensive line links right there.
Yeah, I think that the sum of all of those departures with the opt-out guys we mentioned, as well as now the transfer guys, is tough when you put that all together on that same defensive front. And the two guys you mentioned, I think, were two guys that were looked at as likely of potential starters at the two end spots as anyone. Justin was having that great stretch, kind of putting things together, pieces falling into place middle of last season. And it was just a few days after O talked about him as being their most athletic pass rushing option on the defensive front that you find out he's withdrawn from school and left the team. And so there was, I think, an excitement to get him back into the mix, particularly with the losses of guys like Fehoko and Rashard Lawrence up front, and then with Neil Farrell opting out as well, that Justin Thomas could be a key piece of that defensive line. And TK McClendon, another really athletic guy that originally came to Baton Rouge as a JUCO tight end. There was a lot of optimism for his potential on the other side of the ball. And so to have both those guys out of the mix is definitely tough. Fortunately, there are a couple of veterans that now lead the way of, again, another young bunch in terms of the depth there. But Andre Anthony has certainly waited his turn and shown some of his potential in some opportunities at different positions through his career in Baton Rouge, and Trevez Moore on the other side. They're kind of leading the way for Philip Webb, BJ Ojolari, and the new JUCO transfer, Ali Gay. But I think again, a really talented bunch overall. You would have loved to have those other two weapons involved and that much more depth and that much more experience. But if you just look at these guys in a vacuum and say, these are your 5 or 6 defensive ends, they're pretty good looking football players.
You kind of touched on it, but I was going to ask who you think kind of fills in. So you think right now the next one's up are Dre and Travis Moore. I think those guys are the first names to kind of take the starting spots.
Yeah, I think right now, a couple weeks into camp, kind of hitting that midway point in camp, we're looking at the veterans kind of being the starting lineup across the defensive line with Dre, Apu, Glenn Logan, and Trevez, and a lot of the newer faces kind of pushing them. I think Jaquelin is someone in the middle that I'm very interested to see how things play out for him. And now with Jojo Evans back on the defensive side, he gained a little bit of experience as a true freshman there before transitioning over to starting to work at offensive line. And so he may be a guy that has a slight early edge even after being with a different position group for a while. And then I think Ali Gay, the big JUCO transfer, is one that I'm most interested to see behind the two veterans of LSU's program at defensive end. But the two true freshmen, I think, are going to be kind of banging at that door for their opportunities to play, particularly in some big pass rush type situations on third downs and whatnot. You hear O talk about BJ Ojolari and Phillip Webb, that they're going to have to be involved somewhere at some point. And so that's encouraging to hear that they're showing some of that early.
It's a lot of names to keep your eye on to see which one of these guys actually end up stepping up and filling some of these shoes.
That's what you want, man. The defensive.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. It says next man up. Which one's it going to be? Who is going to be the next man up? You know.
Yeah, when they were at their best a few years ago, it was very rotational, and then they went through some leaner years in terms of the depth chart, and I think that kind of hurt them, particularly in SEC play and in those big Bama games and so on. And they're kind of built back up now to be able to handle this a little bit better than they would have a few years back.
That covers most of the guys departing, at least for now. Coach O said the other day there might be one or two more who are in the same boat considering leaving. So I guess if that does come out, we'll cover that next week on the podcast. Do these losses so far, when you factor in all that they lost to the draft initially, from the seniors gone to the guys who entered the draft early, tack on these 4 who have opted out and the 2 that have transferred, in your mind, Coach O will never say this. He's going to say next man up, don't blink, that kind of thing. In your mind, does this lower any sort of expectation, or do you think this takes LSU a little bit tier below that tier of being one of the top 4, of the elite, pushing for a CFP spot, to maybe a little tier below? Let's push for top 10, a good little bowl game, and kind of revamp for next season. Kind of, how does this change your outlook on the season, if at all?
I think it's so weird to try and kind of plan the math this year, because you switch the schedule, go to a 10-game all-SEC schedule, you take potentially half the teams out of contention, or maybe they're back in because who the heck knows what's going on.
Who knows anymore? The Big Ten.
And some of these other areas. And now in the middle of camp, you're shifting and taking out some of the top performers from last year and anticipated top performers from this year. And so there's so many variables that keep changing every time you try and get a handle on where to predict LSU finishing. And I think before everything started changing, I looked at this team as not the dominant force that we watched last year, just rolling over people and finding its way to 15-0 and really leaving very little doubt along the way. But in that mix that you mentioned, kind of knocking on the door, in contention for a playoff spot, still surprising some people, being in that mix of a 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 type team. And I feel similarly right now. I think they lose some from the guys that we have talked so much about today, but you potentially take some other contenders out. I think looking at the SEC schedule with Jamar and Tyler and all those guys, I looked at them as probably an 8 or 9 win team. I think now I look at them as probably a 7 or 8 win team. I don't think they're going to have a mediocre year. I think there's still a lot of talent there and a lot of reason to be excited if they can kind of get in the right state of mind through some of the tensions and controversies and now some of the losses that they've had early in camp. I think the talent is there to compete with anyone in the conference, and then it just kind of becomes who's there healthy and ready to roll on Saturday and let the chips fall as they may.
I think I'm in the same boat, man. And it's like, again, just going back to last year for a minute, LSU, I mean, I have to pull the schedule in front of me. It felt like, I don't know, 10 or 12 games out of the 15, they were blowing teams out by 20 plus, 30 plus points. I mean, even the playoff, that game against Oklahoma was never close. And so even if you're a notch down from where you were last year, which you will be, that still puts you at being very competitive every single game when you factor in the new offense that they have, a quarterback who, while inexperienced, has been on campus for a long time, but in this offense got to learn behind the greatest quarterback in LSU history. There's still a lot of optimism to be had about this team. And like you said, I think the talent is there. It's hard to question their mindset after last year and kind of how focused all the guys were last year. You always look for some new leaders, but I think Jacoby Stevens has already emerged as a guy who's been a leader. I think Brennan's kind of in the same boat as becoming a leader on the offense. So I think that those questions tend to get answered at times. It's always going to be super weird with this COVID stuff and with no fans, and how does that, or we don't know, I guess we don't know, there's no fans, minimal fans, not a packed house, and how that might affect anything. And it's just in such a weird year for everyone. I'd rather enter the season as sitting where LSU's coming from, having that stability from last year and all the things that were clicking last year, rather than having to be some of these other teams who were bringing in new offenses, or, not that State or Ole Miss are going to be competing for much right now, but just LSU's got some stability. They have their offense. They have their quarterback. They have a lot of talent, that even though they're trying to replace some of the starters, it feels like you can still be optimistic. I think it's one of those teams that can beat anyone on any given day. And as long as you show up on Saturday, you have a good shot to beat anyone. But it'll be fun to watch.
Yeah. I don't want to understate that turnover, because I think it's important to realize that typically championship teams are going to lose some notable pieces to the draft, and it's not just going to be return all those guys next year. And so some of this was expected, but I went through the depth charts from every championship team the past 20 years and then their next year's team and who was still there. And there's only one other team in that span in the entire ballpark of where LSU is now, returning 5 starters from the championship game. And that was the Auburn team after Cam Newton's championship team. And almost every other team, I think, had at least twice as many returning starters as those two teams. And so you lose a lot, sure. But I just think there's a lot of talent there, albeit, as we've both mentioned a lot, unproven young guys. And so it's just going to be interesting to see how some of those Saturdays play out. I think they're going to be in most, if not all, of those games, and it's really just going to come down to some key plays and key minutes. And I think that Miles is going to be better than people necessarily think. You're going to have people that expect huge things from him and some people that completely doubt him and want to compare him to Joe Burrow. I think he's going to be, in terms of more accurate assessments and predictions, leaving out the extremes, I think he's going to be a little bit better than people are giving him credit for. And I think the offense is going to be, while not what it was in 19, be better than it was in 18. And that the defense is going to have an opportunity to have a pretty strong group there again with, guys like Jacoby and Sting and Mo Hampton, I think is going to be huge this year. Cordell Flodd, et cetera, Damone Clark and Jabril Cox, who we didn't mention, but has garnered so much praise through the preseason.
This might be a really dumb take, but for whatever reason, I feel better about the talent LSU's bringing back this year, the depth they have this year, than I have in the past. Partially because I think some of the names that they've been recruiting the past couple of years have been a little notch above, but I think also the system they have in play fits what these guys' abilities are. And so we'll see. We also, hold on. See, it seems sunny outside. little thunderbolt struck, and this one's terrified. So she's gonna join us for this closing question right now because she's freaking out. Last thing I have for you, Jarrett, is the offensive line return to practice after they had a little COVID outbreak. It looked like the starters when they came back were Dare Rosenthal at left tackle, Ed Ingram left guard, Liam Shanahan, the Harvard transfer at center, Chasen Hines at right guard, and Austin Deculus at right tackle. Question number one, kind of a two-parter somewhat. Number one, does that seem like a pretty solid group if they can all, come together? I guess Shanahan's kind of the big question mark. We don't really know what he brings, but coming from Harvard, you got to imagine he's a smart player with some high football IQ in there.
Wicked smart.
And then number two, does that COVID outbreak make you a little bit less optimistic about the season? Does that really impact it? Is the season being played or not being played still a major question mark in your mind, or are you starting to feel a little more confident that it will actually happen, at least to start?
Yeah, I think the closer we get, the more confident I am that we're going to at least start this thing, and then we'll just kind of take it as it comes from there. It's definitely going to be a weird week-to-week circumstance, wondering who may be out, not because of one of the more traditional injuries that we're used to updating our depth charts with, but because of a potential COVID outbreak and guys needing to be quarantined and those sort of factors. And so as much as we want to forecast this year based on talent, who has COVID and how much it spreads amongst the team and at what point in the season might play a huge role even on a full season in terms of what the wins and losses look like on Saturdays. But I do, as we get closer and closer, feel more confident that, we're going to be watching, whether from Tiger Stadium or television or wherever the heck they put Overflow, I don't know, LSU versus Mississippi State that afternoon on September 26th. O-line, I feel, and I meant to say this when I was talking about Miles and the offense being better than 2 years ago, I think the O-line can be better, and I think that'll be a big part of it, because if Rosenthal is where they kind of say he is right now, we've talked about that since his recruitment a couple of years ago. His size and athleticism at that size has such high potential for being, one of the better tackles in the SEC and potentially a tackle for a long time at the next level. Ed Ingram is a guy that people waited anxiously for his return to that room for good reason, because he was as good as anyone on that offensive line when he was getting started in Baton Rouge. Chasen Hines stepped in early, played big roles, now has a couple years under his belt and can be a big piece of a deeper rotation than they had 2 years ago on that offensive line. And then Deculus obviously probably most improved last year amongst that bunch, catching up to kind of the rest of the pack. And I feel good about Liam. I think he's going to be a really good player there in the middle of that offensive line, and that they have some young guys that they kind of trust behind them as well. They suffer some big losses up front, certainly from that great group a year ago. But I think, again, if we're comparing them to kind of the average expectation for what you want to see from an LSU football team, as opposed to arguably the greatest football team we've ever seen a year ago, that it's a group that compares pretty favorably. Just got to be able to stay in practice, stay healthy, and keep getting that chemistry up as we near that opening date.
Yeah, the idea of Rosenthal does excite me because and I think people kind of overlook that he got to fill in for however many games last year when Sadiq Charles was out with his intermittent suspensions that were handpicked by the coaches. But he got some experience last year, getting some decent competition. So if he can keep improving, and like you said, if he's built up a little more than where he was last year, that's an exciting prospect. I think the rest of the guys, aside from Liam, who, like you said, very smart guys who have proven it on the field in the past. So that is an exciting prospect. And yeah, in terms of the COVID aspect of this, it's one of those things that it feels like no matter where I go, anytime I run into a friend or talk to a parent or something, relative on the phone, the first question I get is, "Hey, are we going to have football?" And I'm like, we'll probably start football if I had to guess. If you get to the Bama game, I don't know if we'll make it that far. We'll have to wait and see. And then, next question, are we going to have fans? I don't know. Probably not. It won't be a packed 102,000 of your friends, but maybe there'll be a few thousand in there. I don't know. But lower expectations and invest in a good TV and just don't worry about it.
Yeah, I feel like we're starting a football season here pretty soon, and I think we're gonna be watching in Baton Rouge a crowd situation very similar to what we see popping up all over the country, somewhere between 20 and 30% capacity, and then figuring out how to space folks out. But I don't know if you saw my tweet a couple weeks ago. I officiated a wedding, and as we were waiting for the bride to make her way up, the groom looked at me and said, "So we playing ball this year or what?"
Yeah, I did see that. Yeah.
And I mean, fortunately at that point when I was that much less confident, not that I was leaning that we weren't going to play football at that point, but again, just day by day, I feel more confident. The bride wasn't a slow walker, so I kind of dodged that question for the time being. But, I mean, if he's watching now, yeah, I think we're going to see some football here shortly.
And remember, if there's no football or something bad happens, all you got to do is #blame RC. It's always RC's fault.
Oh, yeah, for sure. This tea, like the sweetness is a little bit off, and I'm texting Ryan as soon as we get off this call.
Thanks, RC. Well, that'll do it for this episode of the Tiger Pride podcast, covering some of the newsy things for this week. We'll do the same probably next week, and then as we get closer to what is at this point the kickoff for the season, we'll start breaking down further the expectations for the offense, defense, special teams. Didn't want to do it too early, seeing as there's still players who could opt out. I don't want to be giving too many predictions, and then a guy is off the team. So we'll see. But for that'll do it. Be sure to follow Jarrett on Twitter at Jarrett Roser. I'm on Twitter at Mark Clements225. And the Tiger Pride podcast, you can search for it on Apple, Android, Spotify, YouTube now, because we'll be posting this on the YouTube. So we're all over the place. Follow us wherever you see fit to follow us. And thanks for listening, and we'll catch y'all next week.
Yeah.